Director of the West European Studies Center. We are delighted to have with us today Professor Isidor Wallimann from Syracuse University, who for many years, almost 3 decades, was a professor of sociology and various other disciplines at the University of Basel. He has been very much involved in the process, in the Bologna process itself, in implementing it, in trying to make sure that it reaches fruition in the European context. So I think he will have many interesting things to say to us, and there will be some opportunity for discussion and questions and answers after he is done. He's a man of Catholic, small c interests in terms of research. Most of his publications seem to be either in German or English, and then in the process of translation into the other language. Perhaps most recently, he has published Globalization and the Third World and Third World Women, Exploitation, Coping, and Resistance. Actually, I think a copy is up here. Actually, 3 of his books are up here if anyone would like to look at them. And he has a book first published in German. The English translation is forthcoming from Syracuse University Press, The Polluter Pays, Principle in Social Policy. But today he's going to focus on the Bologna Reform, which, as we all know, is a sweeping change in higher education, and give us his expertise on that. So please join me in welcoming Professor Wallimann.
Thank you for inviting me, for giving me the opportunity to talk about a very exciting reform which touches upon not just education, but education in a social context, which is political economy context, which is a social policy context, which has all kinds of ramifications, and we'll talk about it, as here already listed on the outline, bit by bit. And it's great to be here. I've had the privilege of being here some 6 years ago at the Institute of Advanced Studies, and then later on, about 3-4 years ago, at the Center for Global Studies, and then in between I gave 1 or 2 lectures like this one, and here I'm again. It's wonderful. I said it's almost like homecoming by now. And I was born in Switzerland. I got some basic training, entry-level training at Switzerland, then worked in Germany and elsewhere in various fields, and then came to the United States for my bachelor, master, and PhD training. And now I'm going back and forth, having worked at the universities in Europe or in Switzerland, and all at the same time published here in the States, and dual track, which is not very ecological because of all flight hours, pollution, and CO2, and I try to compensate to some extent by using public transportation, and right now I don't have a car in Switzerland. So that's it. Now, the Bologna Reform process, has a background. The background is the European Union project. And the European Union project can be seen as a peace project coming out of the war. And before the European Union project started, you had the Montan Union, meaning coal and steel manufacturing in France, Belgium, Netherlands, and Germany were kind of tied into a mutual agreement, essentially peace agreement in dealing with these major resources and having a policy on what they're used for, etc., so that they're not used for the European rearmaments process. So I I would say it that way, but it had a social policy component to it, etc. So this is almost like the noyau of the European Union, which followed. The European Union, as it specified its goals then, was to be economic integration, social integration, political integration. Now, there's some elements are, better met than others. For instance, the social integration is not as well met, and the economic integration is highly met, and in the political integration we are in a limbo, as the financial crisis, mentions. So you have, and it's no longer, these three pillars used to be equally articulated, but it has shifted in favor of one more than the other. And then, of course, you cannot integrate the Europe as a social, economic, and political system without talking about education. And because if you think about it in economic terms and labor market terms, you need to have the educational system coordinated to labor market needs. And if you want to have an integrated European labor market, then you need to have educational systems that are harmonized enough to integrate its graduates into a larger economic space than any particular nation could provide. So the European Bologna process, would then also be kind of necessary to reach some of the goals that the European Union tried to reach. Then you have the continental perspective. At the time, Western Europe had about the same population as the United States, and immediately starting with the European Union, there was also the feeling and the intent to have to be an equal partner with the United States in terms of economy, politics, etc. But to be an equal partner to the United States with about 300 million population as the United States, so roughly about the same magnitudes, you needed to have an integration. Without an integration, it would be split in all kinds of countries, and you would have an equal or a competitive countervailing power or a political countervailing power without the European project at large. And education is now a small element of that. The European integration started with the Bologna Lisbon kind of declaration or convention, and then it was a statement among it amounted to a statement that something ought to be done about this educational space. The Sorbonne Declaration then brought together the major European players, Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, themselves about 240 or 50 million people all together, and they said, now we are really setting out on the project. We are starting. A year later, you had then already 29 or so countries and their educational branches come up with an agreement or with an intention which is called the Bologna Declaration to really now instrumentalize or go ahead in a larger space than the initial 4 countries articulated. So they brought altogether 29 countries on board, and the harmonization was already articulated with specific milestones. One milestone was by year 2010, the higher education space should be harmonized. It should have a bachelor and master level kind of principle to it, and it should have an accreditation to each study course to it. So these were the basic outlines. They were refined along the way a bit, but that is essentially how it worked. Before this Bologna Declaration, you had kind of each country more or less its particular educational system and structure to it, and you had a myriad of systems, a myriad of particularities, a myriad of exemptions here and there for professions, for all kinds of things. And the Bologna Declaration set out to harmonize that for all of Europe. But to know something about this process, we need to make a distinction between, for instance, education and training. Education being that part of education that's broad, that pushes and emphasizes the importance of human existence and human knowledge. It's maybe the humanities plus, but in a more general and not in the training sense. So training would then mean the skills that you can teach at universities or elsewhere to function in a workplace, given you have a certain knowledge, to also function as a professional, etc., with that knowledge. Then you have a notion of science as kind of basic science, if there is anything like it, and applied science, but the difference would be science as basic science. There would be a research and investigation in various fields, which does not think in the first place about application, while the other one would pretty quickly think about how can the knowledge be used. And then you have the university systems in Europe, to some extent, they have double tracking. One would be the University of Applied Sciences, where they emphasize training and skills for jobs, and the universities that were more into science and maybe education, with few exceptions. For instance, most medical training was at universities and not at the University of Applied Sciences, while medicine is a prototype for applied science and not science as such, while maybe life sciences would be basic research type of science. Well, I'm not so sure though now, as it turns out. But so you have in Europe also traditions where in Germany and Austria and Switzerland, an extreme tradition in separating applied science and training on a different higher education track than the rest of the universities that were more into education and basic science were. In the United States, I would say you have a prototype in having campuses where you do both at the same time everywhere. And maybe some campuses specialize, like community colleges or four-year colleges, specialize a bit more on the applied side and training aspect, but on the whole, big universities in the United States have both elements incorporated. Germany has corrected to some extent in certain areas of the country by going into the concept of Gesamthochschule, meaning encompassing higher education campuses, emulating the United States. But on the whole, even in Germany, with this correction, or let's say addition, the tracks remained quite separate between training and applied science and education and science in a more larger sense. So you, for the harmonization it was needed that the degrees be standardized to the question of how much time, how many credit hours would you need for, let's say, a bachelor degree, how much more would you need for a master's degree, how much more for a PhD, etc. But the first 10 years were spent, and it took a full 10 years. And the process may not be completed everywhere yet, but on the whole, it's, I would say, for all practical purposes completed, that at least the bachelor and master's level is not harmonized throughout. So degrees needed to be harmonized, and the formula came out to be 3 plus 2, that would be BA, plus MA, and then plus 3 to 4, that would be the PhD. And then what is very interesting, I think, is that, of course, you have credit hours, and the credit hours are 180 to 240, plus, how much is it exactly? Plus 60 to 120, plus no credit hours specified yet, but it's still in the process. But the formulation right now is 3 to 4 years of full-time studies. And that is, what is then a full-time study? So, and credit hours, that would be the European credit transfer system, credit hours. 1 credit hour would have 25 to 30 hours of workload. So you begin to define the standardization as a workplace. And through the standardization, you introduce the element of workload, and then each credit hour, should encompass about 25 to 30 hours of workload. The workload would include class attendance, homework, exam time, preparation for exam time, which will be included more in homework, but it became a kind of a transparent factory model of education. And in terms of internal university dynamics, this process stopped any professor who thought he was more important than the other guy, or she was more important than the other person. And because, as I have experienced teaching in the United States, I may be culprit myself, but there is this one-upmanship. How much do students have to work for me, as opposed to my other colleague who is, in a group dynamic process, considered to be inferior or superior. So you then have in the curriculum transparency, also with then how you operationalize the classroom, what's being asked from the students to read. Let's say in an average hour, an average student, or in an hour, an average student could read maybe 10 pages of serious, difficult text, maybe 20 pages of not so serious text, and suddenly you have transparency in workload, and then you could go, one colleague could go to another, or the department meeting can then ask for transparency, how much do students really have to work for a credit hour and where. At the same time, the students have a certain degree of, let's say, they have a certain legal position that protects them against abuse. because they can also go then and claim that the credit hours, they have to do too much work for a credit hour. Alternatively, somebody could say, you know, this credit hour doesn't use the full workload that's thought to be, and so you have a more, let's say, protecting frame to learn, but at the same time you define learning like work. So learning becomes work like a factory, and the university has throughput systems, and with that workload system and credit hours associated, you can funnel through so many students, and altogether per year, I mean per semester, you will have about 30 credit hours, and that would be 6 times would be a bachelor's degree. And then you would have also, oh, I lost my train of thought. So you would have predictability for the student and from the university and for the organization, and at the same time the factory mode of learning. So in terms of business administration and efficiency of workplace and kind of, let's say, or the organization, previously you had in Europe students who were hanging around, students who were fast. Presently, you know, you can hang around and, you know, take a credit hour here, a credit hour there, have half a workload or full workload depending on your life situation, but there is no hanging around and occupying, you know, let's say space and infrastructure that is not being used. Then you also have the stipend situation. Well, previously the stipend was given to students to study. Some took 4 years, some took 6 years, and there was maybe not necessarily a limit to the stipend in terms of years, or some for 4 years and some for 6 years. And then you had, you know, ambivalence. Is that student now really studying or just using up the stipend? And in Germany, they would call it, we give you a stipend, and we define the Regelstudienzeit. So the Regelstudienzeit would then be 4 or 5 years, and you would get the stipend for 4 or 5 years. If you didn't do your work, then you were out. But this Regelstudienzeit didn't allow you to study part-time, and this was a huge conflict within, let's say, that stipend structure and definition of workload. And with the Bologna Reform, important is the credit hour you get, and not how many at one time. And then you can study 10 years, but the stipend structure had to be adjusted for it, and is still not really well adjusted for it. They still give stipends too much along notions of Regelstudienzeit, you know, the normal. But some biographies don't conform to being a full-time student for gender role matter or for other, all kinds of things happen. And then you need to go part-time, and certain stipend and social policy systems are not adjusted to it. But this is the basic outline of the reform process. Then harmonizing